So everyone, tonight I'm going to be talking about the Battle of Kursk. This was a major especially tank battle on the Eastern Front, 1943, during World War II, and it's often called the largest tank battle in history. Although recent research has suggested that another battle, known as the Battle of Brody, may have been larger, but this was a very significant engagement. It's not as well known as battles like Stalingrad or the Battle of the Bulge, which is part of the reason why I'd like to talk about this battle today. But it was still an extremely significant fight on the Eastern Front that really changed the outcome of the war, or hastened the outcome of the war considerably, depending on which way you look at it. So before I begin, I would like to take a moment of silence for our veterans from our country who have fought in wars throughout history, World War II and all other conflicts. Okay. Again, I'd like to say thank you to all our veterans. Part of this presentation, why I'm giving this presentation today, is so we can remember history. And just as we should remember history, we should remember our veterans who have fought for our country. Okay. So, the Battle of Kursk. So before I get to talking about the actual battle, I would first like to talk about the lead up to the battle, all the background. So here we have a map of Europe during World War II, 1939 to 1941. So Nazi Germany in 1939 invaded Poland to begin the war in Europe and all of World War II, unless you consider the Asian theater with Japan and China. But by most accounts, it started on September 1st, 1939 with the invasion of Poland. Then in 1940, Germany invaded Denmark and Norway, and then shortly thereafter, they invaded France and Belgium. So at that point, Germany had taken over much of Europe. And in 1941, the Germans decided to turn their attention east to the USSR. Now, the reason for this was part of the Nazi ideology, it was known as Lebensraum, living space. They wanted to invade the eastern nations, so Poland, which happened in 1939, and then the USSR, and displace those Slavic peoples, and basically take their land and make it into farmland, and also settle it with German people, basically to colonize and put farmland all over that place to help Germany become stronger and stronger. And in addition to that, it seemed that war with the Soviet Union and Germany was inevitable anyways, as they were both growing military powers, and Hitler and Stalin really distrusted each other. And even though they signed a non-aggression pact in 1939, which helped them divide up Poland, as the USSR also invaded Poland from the east, they still really distrusted each other, and war was basically inevitable. It was just a matter of who would strike first. There have even been accounts of, research has even shown that Stalin was planning to possibly attack the Germans at some point, later in the 1940s perhaps, but as it stands, Germany was the one who struck first. In June of 1941, Hitler invaded in what was known as Operation Barbarossa, named after Frederick Barbarossa, a famous German emperor from the Crusades era. And this offensive caught the Soviets off guard, despite the fact that they had intelligence stating that there would be a German attack. And the Germans basically, at the start, they completely routed the Soviets. There were huge encirclements at Kiev in Ukraine, and in Minsk in Belarus. Now here's a more detailed map of Barbarossa. So you can see these are the major pockets and fierce areas of fighting which the Germans moved through. They divided their army into three: Army Group North, Center, and South. North headed towards Leningrad, Center headed towards Moscow, and South headed towards Ukraine and in the general direction of the Caucasus area. And these three armies, they kept moving rapidly, although towards July, October, they started to slow down, as they were taking so many Soviet soldiers prisoner and defeating large Soviet armies in these battles, like at Kiev. But the thing was, even though they were winning, it was still taking them time to do this, which was slowing down their offensive. and it was eating away time that they needed before the Russian winter set in. So eventually the winter did start to set in, and another thing was that Hitler diverted a lot of troops away from Moscow to attack Ukraine, because in Ukraine the Germans had an opportunity where they had encircled the Soviet army. It was actually the largest encirclement in military history up until that point near Kiev, and they diverted more troops to seal that off, and also just to take the general farmland of Ukraine. And so in the end they didn't have enough, because they diverted forces, they didn't have enough to take Moscow, and in December the Battle of Moscow occurred, which ended with a German defeat. The Soviets just barely managed to hold their ground. Now, in 1942, the Germans decided to make a renewed offensive against the Soviet Union, this time targeting the city of Stalingrad in the south. Their aim was to move into the Caucasus region to get the oil fields there, which they needed to sustain their war effort. But it soon became clear that they would not get a lot of those oil wells before the Soviets burned them ahead of the advancing German forces, so they wouldn't fall intact. And also they needed to cover their northern flank, and on the northern flank was the city of Stalingrad. So basically those two factors combined to make the nexus of the German offensive directed at this city. And the Soviets wanted to defend the city at all costs, mainly because it held the name of Stalin, and they didn't want that that would be a huge morale or prestige blow to them, to have the city, especially for Stalin himself, to have that city fallen into German hands. So both sides started pouring troops into this battle around Stalingrad, and it went into the city. There was very fierce house-to-house, block-to-block combat in the city, and it was almost completely destroyed. And after a few months of fighting, the Germans had captured most of the city, but then a major Soviet offensive occurred on both sides. On the German flanks outside the city, they had Allied troops, Romanians and Italians, that had weaker equipment, and they weren't able to stand up to this major Soviet attack. And the Soviets wheeled around in both directions and completely encircled the city. So now an entire German army, the 6th Army, was trapped there, and they weren't able to break out. They first attempted to supply them with the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, with airdrop supplies, but that didn't work. And they weren't able, in the end, they weren't able to break out. The whole army was eventually surrendered. The General Paulus, he actually Hitler promoted him to field marshal, because he hoped, when he was about to surrender, because he hoped that he would not, if he was promoted to field marshal, he wouldn't surrender at all, because no field marshal in German military history had ever been taken prisoner alive. But he ended up not surrendering, so that trend ended, and the whole German army surrendered. Now these Soviet forces were free to go on the offensive, which they did. Through Operation Star and Gallop, the Soviets started pushing the Germans back west and reversing their gains they had made up until this point. Now, this had really thrown the German high command and Hitler into a big panic, because their forces were getting completely routed, and Hitler turned to one of his best generals, arguably actually the best general of the war. The best German general of the war. Does anyone know who I'm talking about?
Erich von Manstein.
Yep.
Hitler.
Erich von Manstein.
Oh, okay.
Yep, that's right, von Manstein. So von Manstein he fought in the Battle of Poland and the Battle of France. He was actually one of them that kind of had the whole idea for the successful French campaign, the way they went around the Maginot Line and everything. And Hitler put him in command of the German forces in the area. And what became known as the Third Battle of Kharkov, von Manstein allowed the Soviets to gain a bunch of ground, and he basically made them outrun their supplies, and then launched a massive counterattack on their flanks, which basically enveloped them, and the Soviet armored spearheads were caught completely off guard and destroyed. It was known as the backhand blow technique. So the Soviet offensive was completely stalled there, and basically both sides now had no initiative. The Germans didn't manage to gain the initiative after that battle, as even though they destroyed it, or they trapped, captured, destroyed so many Soviet vehicles, killed so many troops, it still wasn't enough in the big picture. So both sides basically came down to a stalemate at that point. Now here's a picture of von Manstein himself. And after the Third Battle of Kharkov, the front, as I said, the front stabilized. But what happened now was we have the front up here. Everyone noticed something, which was that there was a giant bulge in the front, a giant salient, if you will. A salient's the same thing. So if you've ever heard of, if you know about the Battle of the Bulge, where it was a big bulge in the line, it's the same thing here, and it was protruding to the west into the German lines. Both sides saw this, and von Manstein advocated quickly attacking this salient, because if you have a bulge like this, and if you attack here and here, it's not very hard to, as long as you can get to the defenses, there's much less ground to cover, so you can completely isolate all the armies and troops in that salient. So von Manstein advocated attacking, and von Manstein specifically was in command of Army Group South, which was down here, and he tried to persuade Gunther von Kluge, which was the commander of Army Group Center, which was up here, to assist in his attack, but von Kluge stated that he couldn't. He didn't have enough forces to, and so then von Manstein went to Hitler, and because Hitler came to von Manstein, and he's like, what? He's like, I need a new operation here, and Hitler wanted a counterattack, but von Manstein wanted a defensive operation, and Hitler overrided von Manstein, and he's like, oh no, we really need an attack. And so basically they started planning for an operation. They codenamed it Citadel, which is the German word for citadel. And this operation was to take place in May of 1943, which would give the Germans a little time to build up their forces, like von Kluge's in the north, to attack. And so it was originally delayed to May, but as time kept going on, Hitler decided to delay it even more, mainly because he wanted to keep building up German forces, particularly because he wanted some new tanks, which we'll talk about in a little bit. He thought that these tanks would really help turn the tide of the battle when it would occur, or give the Germans a considerable advantage. So as the Germans were planning for this operation, which would involve two attacks, one in the north, one in the south, on the ends of the salient to cut it off. And as they were preparing for this, the Soviets were also they also saw the bulge, the salient, and they were reinforcing it as well. They basically turned the whole thing into a giant fortress. They built 3 defensive lines with barbed wire, hundreds of thousands of anti-personnel and anti-tank mines. They put tons of tanks there, tons of infantry units, basically everything in the kitchen sink in the Kursk salient. It was, by the way, it was named the Kursk salient because it was near the city of Kursk, which was like right in the middle. But anyways, they kept reinforcing it, digging trenches. They employed a strategy known as maskerovka, which is it's like the Russian term for deception operations that they used. For example, they would just camouflage tanks like that, or they would build dummy airfields. Actually, during the initial stages of this battle, when the Germans attacked the Russian airfields, it's reported that a high percentage of those attacks were actually against fake airfields, not real ones. So it was pretty effective. And then in addition to that, there were a bunch of partisan operations occurring behind the German lines, because at the start, they especially had the support of these partisans, because at the start of the war, when Hitler moved into Ukraine, particularly Ukraine, and also the Baltic, also the parts of the Baltic states, which had been basically annexed by the Soviets at the start of the war. The people here regard the Germans as liberators, because the Soviets had subjected them to oppression, and the Germans could have treated them well, and then had much bigger base for propaganda, for civilian production and everything, and for also military service. But instead, a lot of these people were Jews especially, and they murdered them, they oppressed them, even worse than the Soviets. So the Soviets actually had the support of a lot of these partisans who hated the Germans. and they were actually very effective at disrupting German supplies and the build-up to this battle. The Soviet Army and Air Force actually directly coordinated with them at some points by dropping them supplies and stuff. And also, in addition to that, the British had supplied the Soviets with intelligence from Bletchley Park, right up here. That's a picture of Bletchley Park. It's this famous place in Britain, which is known as like a hub for like intelligence. It's the same place where they cracked the Enigma, the German Enigma codes. And so their spies had word that the Germans were planning an offensive near Kursk. So the Soviets were basically confirmed that the Germans were going to attack there. So they were, as I said, they were able to build up considerable forces in that area. So now, before I get in, we're getting close to the battle. Before I talk about the battle, I'd like to talk about the aforementioned tanks, so I don't have to do it in the middle. And it's really important to do this because the tanks, this was a major tank battle, one of the biggest tank battles. As I said earlier, the Battle of Brody during Operation Barbarossa actually may have been larger than this, but in any case, this is one of the largest tank battles in history. So here I have some German and Soviet tanks that fought during the Battle of Kursk. So first I'll talk about the Germans. Now, German tank doctrine at the start of the war was very different than what it would be towards the end, towards the middle and end. They started out with very light tanks that were generally quick and well suited to the blitzkrieg style of warfare, where like rapid movement and all that, which is what helped them really conquer Poland, France, and also the early stages of Operation Barbarossa. It really helped them move quick. Those tanks were like the Panzer I, Panzer II, and then the slightly heavier Panzer III and IV, which I have here. But when they finally invaded the Soviet Union in 1941, they started coming up against, they mostly came up against these lighter tanks like T-26s, which is what I have here. This is actually an older version which has 2 machine gun turrets on it. The newer versions had generally just one big turret with a gun on it. But they were mostly coming up against those, but there were a small percentage of Soviet tanks that were larger and more modern, which were the T-34 right here and the KV-1 right here. So these 2 tanks, the German guns couldn't, at most distances and most angles, the Germans couldn't penetrate the armor of these tanks, or at least they had a lot of difficulty doing it. And oftentimes they had to bring in like big 88mm guns, which were more suited to defense, to take out these tanks. And they did have some trouble during the Battle of France with some of the more well-armored French tanks, but they didn't really learn from it that much, and so they were still very surprised when they came up against these big Soviet tanks with lots of armor. This one's a beast. It just has a ton of armor that couldn't be penetrated by any of these later German tanks. This one, the T-34, its big suit is that it has sloped armor, which was very good at deflecting shells. And both of these tanks had the same 75mm gun, but that could penetrate the German tanks. And so they basically had to make bigger tanks to defeat these. And Hitler also was very big on making his tanks bigger and bigger and bigger. So the next development would be the Tiger tank right here. This is a very famous heavy tank. This had very strong armor and a high velocity 88mm gun. The same one the same famous one that they had as like a fixed or towed emplacement. That was originally an AA gun, but they made it an anti-tank gun because it was so powerful. And then the other big one for this time was the Panther tank. The Panther was a medium tank, kind of the successor to the Panzer IV, but it had some sloped armor on the front, which they had learned from fighting T-34s, and the armor was generally pretty strong. It had a very powerful 75mm gun, and it was generally a force to be reckoned with. And so Hitler part of the reason why he delayed the Battle of Kursk, or actually the main reason, was because he wanted more quantities of these Tiger tanks and Panther tanks to be delivered to the German units before the attack, because he thought they would significantly strengthen the German effort in the battle. Particularly the new Panther, which had actually never seen combat. This was the combat debut of this tank. And then we also had another, I don't have a model of it, but the Ferdinand, also known as the Elephant. It's a tank destroyer, and it was a pretty big beast. But the thing was, it was more suited to defense. So we'll see. I'll talk about what happened in the battle a little later. But the Soviet tanks, I already explained. Here are the Soviet tanks. Again, there's a T-34, there's the KV-1. This is a T-70 light tank, which is kind of like the T-26, like similar characteristics and stuff. And then that's an M3 Lee, which was an American tank that they sold to the Soviets because we had the U.S. was providing Lend-Lease aid, so they had a lot of tanks that they were selling to the Soviets. Now, also aircraft. I won't talk much about the air battles during the actual when I'm actually talking about the battle, but I will mention them now. The aircraft they used. So the Germans used the Junkers Ju-87 Stuka dive bomber right here. This was another very famous plane with a distinctive gull wings. If you look, the wings are like bent like that, and this was actually equipped with. They equipped it with 30mm anti-tank cannons, fast-firing cannons, which would be used for strafing tanks. And they also the Soviets had the WW2 Sturmovik ground attack plane, which was another very famous, probably arguably the most famous Soviet plane of the whole war. There's a picture of it up here, and there's the Stuka up there. This one actually has the 30mm cannons if you look closely. Yeah, but the Sturmovik, Stuka, both very famous ground attack planes. They saw a lot of combat in Kursk. Kursk was actually the first, it was the first battle where the Germans really changed their aircraft doctrine, because beforehand the Luftwaffe had, in terms of air-to-ground support, they had done a lot of like bombing behind the lines and like taking out supply depots and stuff and bases with carpet bombers and stuff. Whereas more strategic operations. Whereas in the Battle of Kursk, they switched towards more close air support and supporting the ground troops rather than working a little more independently and hitting further behind the lines. And then down there, there's along with the Stuka, another close air support plane they used, which also its debut was Kursk, was the HS-129 right there. It has a bunch of cannons on the front, which can use to hit Soviet tanks. And then these are some new Soviet fighters which were just appearing around the time of Kursk, like the Yak-9 and the La-5. These planes finally gave the Soviets a bit of parity with the German fighters, because beforehand they were working with older planes generally. Now I'll talk briefly go through the generals of the battle. So the German forces were divided into two major groups. Attacking from the north would be Army Group Center, which was the overall command was Gunther von Kluge, and under him, spearheading the attack, would be the 9th Army under General Walter Model, and they would be opposing Konstantin Rokossovsky of the Central Front. Now, a front is basically the equivalent of like an army group in English or in American terms. Now, in the south was Erich von Manstein's Army Group South, although he was also kind of the de facto leader of the whole operation, but specifically he commanded Army Group South, which was composed of the 4th Panzer Army under Hermann Hoth and also Werner Kempf's Army Detachment Kempf, which was basically like an ad hoc unit of like just other forces that their strength had been reduced in previous battles, or they were just on hand in the area. They kind of all combined them into this army detachment. And then they were their main foe was Nikolai Vatutin's Voronezh front. So that was the south. Now, in reserve, the Soviets also had the Steppe front under General Ivan Konev, and the overall commander of Soviet forces, kind of the equivalent of von Manstein, was Zhukov, who was Deputy Supreme Commander. You know Zhukov? I see a few of you. Yep, he was very famous. In my opinion, I actually think he's a bit overrated, but that's something for another day. But he was the overall commander of the forces. Now here's the order of battle. So as you can see, the statistics kind of speak for themselves. The Germans were heavily outnumbered in almost every respect. Nobody looked at that. 25,000 artillery to 1,000. I guess a lot of that's because they were fighting on the defense, but they were outnumbered significantly in tanks and men on both fronts. In the center, Army Group Center and Army Group South were both considerably outnumbered. So the thing to note though is, again, the German tanks were generally heavier than the Soviet tanks, which we'll see how that goes in the battle. And some of their lighter tanks, like this Panzer IV, they often outgunned them from what they had before. Now, the Battle of Kursk began on July 5th. Sometimes they say July 4th, depending on like where you are in the world. But we'll just say July 5th for now to keep it simple. So the Germans began their offensive on that day. The night before, actually, or the day before, a German soldier actually defected from the German lines because they'd been feeding them this schnapps, which is like a food that the soldiers had never, or the Germans only gave that to their troops right before a big battle. So this one guy was really jittery, and he defected to the Soviet lines, and he told them the Germans are about to attack at Kursk, right here at Kursk. And so the Germans, the Soviets were now went on high alert, and Zhukov ordered a major artillery bombardment to attack the German troops before they started their offensive the next day, which it actually didn't do very much, even though it was like a preemptive attack. Because the Germans had been planning for this for so long, and they had taken a lot of caution, so it didn't really disrupt their setting up for the attack. But yeah, so there was a big artillery bombardment, which was actually soon met by a very strong German counter bombardment that took out a lot of the Soviet guns or suppressed them. So already the Soviets have a setback, and then they also started attacking the German airfields very quickly, and this also kind of didn't go as well as they'd hoped. They did destroy some German planes, but not a lot. Most of the main Soviet air attack actually occurred they tried to get it in very quickly before the Germans could scramble their planes, but the Germans managed to get them in the air just in time, and so they mostly devolved in a bunch of dogfights, which didn't go as well for the Soviets as they'd hoped. But as you can see up here, Army Group Center with the 9th Army started coming in from the north. Army Group South started coming in from the south near Belgorod. So here's the northern sector. We'll go over this first. So Model's 9th Army started advancing, and this was spearheaded by the 505th Heavy Tank Battalion, which was mostly Tiger tanks. This was spearheading the attack, and they advanced decently. They started advancing pretty rapidly, but they soon got bogged down. Their objective was There are two objectives: were the towns of Olklavatka and Ponyri, and they managed to penetrate towards. They managed to get to Ponyri, and despite the Soviets launched some counterattacks with tanks, but they were almost completely wiped out. Didn't go very well. And the Germans did manage to take Ponyri, but they weren't able to get to Olklavatka. They fell just short of it. Yeah, but that was basically the first offensive. So it bogged down around this line here, and there were also thousands of, as I said, or hundreds of thousands of Soviet mines that had been laid, and a lot of these German tanks were driving right into these mines, and the Germans, they obviously send mine clearers into the fields, but that's what they were supposed to do, and oftentimes the mine clearers they were trying to move so quickly that they didn't get all the mines, or sometimes they just drove right into the fields without even really checking them. So a lot of tanks were lost to these minefields very quickly, including a lot of the new Ferdinand tank destroyers that I mentioned earlier. I think it was like half of them were lost either to mechanical failures or to mines very quickly. But in the south, Werner Kempf's Army Detachment Kempf and Holt's 4th Panzer Army started advancing, and they met heavy resistance with those minefields. Their objective was the town of Obagan, and they actually, as they were pushing, they met better success than the Ninth Army in the north. They advanced much further. There was a pretty significant Soviet counterattack near the town of Kursk, but it was also a complete fiasco, really. The Germans completely wiped it out, in part because actually part of that unit was completely destroyed by aircraft. Like, it was the first time in military history that a tank formation had been destroyed 100% by planes without support from ground troops. So these Stukas came in and destroyed the whole thing. Like, here's a picture of that's actually a German convoy, I believe, not a Russian one, but there were a lot of strikes like that on both sides against the enemy tanks. So yeah, they were moving towards Oblagan, but they kind of shifted their objective towards Werner Kemp's force moved towards Korocha, and the 4th Panzer Army kind of shifted a little bit north towards the village of Prokhorovka, which was right by Kursk. Yeah, so they advanced a good deal further. Here's a map of Army Group South. I believe they penetrated about 30 miles, and in the north it was about 10 miles, which it doesn't seem like much, but in terms of like a big front like this, where there's so many defensive lines, it was a decent advance. They actually got farther than the Germans didn't get as far as they expected they would, but the Soviets actually thought that they got farther than the Soviets expected they would. So basically, the Germans exceeded the Soviets' expectations, but not their own, which is kind of interesting. But yeah, anyways, they kept moving. Now here's some other pictures of the southern attack. There's an anti-tank rifle, the PTRG anti-tank rifle. The Soviets were really using anything they could against the German forces. They had a lot of anti-tank guns, but they were still using some of the older rifles, which might be useful against some of the lighter German tanks. But against something like a Panther or Tiger, they do absolutely nothing. But anyways, this attack also was spearheaded. Up here you can see a picture of a Tiger tank from this unit, the 2nd SS Panzer Corps, which was composed of some of the most elite units in the Wehrmacht, the German military, which were specifically the Panzer Division, SS Panzer Division, Totenkopf, Leibstandarte, and Das Reich. These 3 divisions were equipped with some of the best tanks the Germans had to offer, like Tigers and Panthers. And they basically spearheaded the attack towards Prokhorovka. They were attached to the 4th Panzer Army. But so as I said, they were moving to this village Prokhorovka, and the Soviets started moving forces to counter them. Now the German forces stopped, and overnight they stopped near the village, and the Soviet forces arrived. And then the next morning, General Romistrov, he was like the field commander in the area. He gave the command "Steal, steal, steal," or "Stal, stal, stal" in Russian, which began the attack. And all of a sudden, all these Soviet tanks surged towards the Germans on the fields of Prokhorovka, and the Soviets had about 600 tanks, most of which were T-34s, and the Germans had about 300, so they were outnumbered about 2 to 1. But General Romistrov, he kind of kicked himself in the foot because he ordered the tanks to close to a very, just keep going straight forward and close to a very short distance, the Germans, and attack keep shooting without stopping, so they were firing while they're moving, thus reducing their accuracy. And this, so that kind of limited their effectiveness a bit. But what this also resulted in was a bunch of very close-range tank battles, like tanks were literally ramming each other and flipping each other. There were instances of tanks literally flipping each other over, I believe, or driving sort of on top of one another. It was kind of just craziness. So very, very close-range, hectic tank battles, and the Germans actually showed off how good their new tanks were. Now, a lot of these new tanks, like the Panther tanks especially, since they were so new, they had been pushed into service so quickly, so hastily. Their crew didn't have the crews were poorly trained, and they didn't know how to operate a lot of these tanks. So a lot of them were lost to mechanical difficulties before they even got to the battle. But because because the crew couldn't, like the crew just didn't know how to operate them correctly. But once they actually got into the battle, they showed that they absolutely dominated over Soviet tanks in general. The Germans lost during the Battle of Prokhorovka in total. They lost like 60 to 80 tanks. The Soviets lost like 400 or so. So a very huge disparity there. But as I said, the Soviet tanks surged forward. They actually managed to breach. So at the top, if you're looking from like north to south or just like that, at the top was Totenkopf and then Leibstandart. Those two divisions were fighting alongside each other, and right between them, the Soviet was positioned attached to Leibstandart was the 1st SS Panzer Recon Battalion, and the Soviets managed to actually rout that and break through the German lines, and a bunch of their tanks got behind the Germans and started threatening supplies and stuff. And a mere 4 Tiger tanks from the Leibstandart division managed to seal completely on their own. They sealed the entire gap, and they held it off. They held the gap for a little while, and then a renewed Soviet attack came, and they were routed. But the Germans did eventually. The Germans did plug that gap eventually, but the Russian tanks just kept coming and coming. These tanks, the T-34s were not really a match for something like a Panther. If you even looking here, they're so much smaller. But they just had so many of them. The Germans couldn't take all of them out, so they eventually retreated from Prokhorovka, or they withdrew a little ways. So even though there was a huge disparity in losses, the Soviets declared a victory because they had forced the Germans to halt their offensive and pull back a little bit. And right after this failure for the Germans, Hitler and his generals von Manstein ordered Operation Roland, which was basically like a counterattack to try to put a renewed offensive, I should say, around Prokhorovka, which would try to like encircle the Soviet forces there that had been weakened by the previous battle. But the thing was, as we'll see coming up, that wasn't able to be executed as planned. So now, shortly after the Battle of Prokhorovka, which this took place on July 12th, Prokhorovka did, and on the same day as that took place, the Soviets launched Operation Kutuzov, they had been building up for this for a while. It was to the north of the German lines, and this is by the way not Kutuzov. I'll get to this in a moment, but it was to the north. They attacked the Bryansk front, which up until this point wasn't involved in the battle, under General Pavel. That attacked all the way to the north, above the German forces that were engaged in combat. Basically started outflanking the 9th Army, Model's army, and so Model was worried about being trapped, so his forces had to withdraw from Kursk. And with that, Hitler, and then also as that operation took place, the Allies also invaded Sicily in the west, and that seems like a pretty far distance away. But considering it was a pretty significant invasion, and it would actually eventually, within a few weeks, lead to the downfall of Mussolini. Italy surrendered and officially switched to the Allied cause. But anyways, that operation really threw Hitler into a panic, especially because he was worried about this new front that he had to defend. So Operation Kutuzov, the success of that, combined with the invasion of Sicily and the failure of the Germans to attack Prokhorovka, basically Hitler ordered them to cancel the Kursk operation and begin withdrawing. So the aforementioned Operation Roland, which von Manstein wanted to launch to encircle Soviet forces, Hitler said no, and von Manstein, as always, was persistent. And so Hitler finally said, okay, you can have some forces, but it wasn't nearly enough to do. It was just enough to like stall the Soviet forces. It wasn't enough to deal a decisive blow. But in general, Manstein was also kind of annoyed with the timing of Hitler's withdrawal, because in reality, he was actually very close to achieving the breakthrough he needed. So both of the German forces, the North and the South, had gotten through 2 of the 3 Soviet defensive lines, but Manstein's force the North had kind of attacked the second one, but the South had actually kind of passed it and was approaching the third. And they were very close to achieving a decisive breakthrough if he had launched another offensive. And so Manstein was really annoyed, but you can't really argue with Hitler, can you? Or else he'll do bad things to you. So yeah, they were forced to withdraw. And then as they were withdrawing shortly afterwards, the Soviets in the south launched the second phase of their counterattack, Operation Rumanskiev, which attacked the withdrawing Army Group South, von Manstein, Hoth, and Kemp's forces. So this is a map of that. They pushed them all the way back through Belgorod down here, and this would actually lead to later on it would lead to the Fourth Battle of Kharkov, which this time it wasn't, unlike the third battle, it wasn't a major German victory. The Soviets kind of just took the city. But yeah, so the Kursk operation was, they were to bring it back. This is these are some photos of Kutuzov. The Kutuzov did meet with pretty significant success as it started. Those are some Tiger tanks withdrawing down there. Now yeah, so as the Germans retreated, they actually burned a lot of villages and stuff, because both sides during the battle and during the war in general had what was called scorched earth tactics. Does anyone know what that means?
No.
Anyone? That's like when you're fighting in a war, in order to deny supplies to the enemy as you're retreating, you just burn everything. And they actually did it sometimes when they attack too, but oftentimes when you're retreating, you burn everything, the fields, the towns and stuff, so the supplies and infrastructure and everything can't fall into enemy hands. But yeah, that's what the Germans did here. Here's some pictures of them withdrawing. That's a Panther tank up there, and that's a Soviet artillery gun being moved forward for the offensive.
By a horse?
Huh?
By a horse? Is that what they...
Yes, those are by horses. It's actually often a misconception, but World War II, it's often looked at as a very mechanized war, but in reality, only the U.S. and British armies were really fully mechanized. Even both of those armies still use horses to a certain capacity, but all the other armies, especially the biggest one is Germany. Everyone thinks Germany was completely mechanized and everything when you see these panzers and trucks and half-tracks and stuff. But they actually relied significantly on horses. So yeah, those are horses pulling those artillery guns. But yeah, so they were withdrawing. The Kursk operation was canceled. These are all the casualties from the battle. As you can see, even though the Soviets won, there was a very significant disparity in the number of the amount of forces that the Soviets and Germans lost. If you look, they lost like almost 10 times as many tanks. They lost like 4 times as many men or so. So 4 or 5 times as many artillery guns. You know, the stats speak for themselves. But this was kind of typical of the whole war. Again, the major Soviet doctrine for everything was like quantity over quality. So they often sacrificed training and equipment, and on their tanks, they sacrificed power and armor for quantity. Like the T-34 was very easy to produce. They could build tons of these, and it was actually even, I should say that they did put quality on some respects, like the heavy armor on this thing that the early German tanks couldn't stand up to. But by the time of Kursk, this was outclassed by the Tiger and Panther. So it was more quantity over quality, and that's really what you see here. This was typical of the whole entire war, really. Now, here are just some cool pictures I found from the battle, if you'd like to see, of like destroyed stuff, destroyed tanks. This is a T-34 that a German's looking at. It's been knocked out. Another thing I'll note now actually is that these are T-34 76s, which, because if you see a tank, if you ever seen one of these tanks before, you might be wondering why it looks a little different. Because in the later in the war, they upgraded these tanks they called them the 85s. which had a stronger gun. 85 stands for 85 millimeter, 76 stands for 76 millimeter. That's what this one is too. It's a T-34-76. But that's again, the backbone of Soviet forces. Up there, that's a KV-1 that apparently it was hit by aircraft because it's been completely like flipped up and it looks like onto another tank. So that was hit by bombs. That's really the only thing that would be like bombs or artillery probably that would be powerful enough to lift such a heavy machine. And then down there's a Panzer II in the front. That's actually one of the lighter tanks that they use, especially from the earlier Blitzkrieg start of the war. I don't have one with me, unfortunately, and then up there that's a destroyed Tiger tank. Actually, I don't even think that's the turret up there. I think that might just be the gun. It's kind of hard to tell, but no, maybe it is the turret. It's just a very weird positioning, but when things get destroyed, they kind of just go everywhere. So yeah, this is in the aftermath of Kursk. Again, it was a major Soviet victory. Even like the disparity of men, even though it was a tactical German victory in that sense, but strategically it was a Soviet victory because after this point, the Germans were never able to launch a major offensive on the Eastern Front again, unless you count towards the end of the war they launched one in Hungary, but that was nothing near this. So basically they completely lost the initiative on the Eastern Front for the whole rest of the war. The Soviets were just pushing them back towards Berlin. And they were also, at the same time in the South, they'd actually, one of the other things that contributed to the withdrawal from Kursk, German withdrawal, was they attacked in the Donbass region of Ukraine. And it was actually a German defensive victory, but the Germans moved some forces that were supposed to help in the Kursk offensive to defend that region, so that sort of weakened the German attack as well. But yeah, after Kursk, there was the Fourth Battle of Kharkov, which I talked about earlier a bit. The Battle of another battle at Smolensk, they recaptured that. Then there was the Battle of the Dnieper River, and then the subsequent Dnieper-Carpathian offensive, which basically kept pushing the Germans back towards Poland. And then the big one was in 1944, they launched Operation Bagration, which it was this massive offensive, which basically went all the way into Warsaw. They pushed the Germans back. So at that point, that basically Kursk set the stage for this point where the Germans were getting completely routed. But at that point now one thing I'd like to talk about, now that we've finished talking about the actual battle and everything, is what ifs regarding Kursk. What could the Germans have done to win this battle? And so the first thing to consider is, what about if they'd attacked earlier in like February or so, when the Germans after this, or March, after Stalingrad, after the Third Battle of Kharkov, when they had right after they had stopped the Soviets there. Well, the thing was, the reason they didn't attack then again is because, remember, Kluge said he didn't have enough forces to attack in the north. Well, Manstein thought he had enough, but looking at the statistics and the defenses there, the Soviets still had, even though they had just been halted, they still had considerable forces in the area, so it's not likely that a German attack at that time would have actually succeeded. The Germans didn't have enough equipment after Stalingrad and Kharkov. They hadn't gotten enough of their units back up to full strength yet, and they weren't ready. They hadn't trained or anything. They weren't ready to make a hasty attack. They had to wait a little bit. Now, attacking a little bit later attacking a little later might have like towards June or July might have worked a little better, but still probably wouldn't have been enough. This was probably around the prime time to make a move. The thing was that one thing was that they could have stayed on the defensive instead of going on the attack. That's the one big thing, and this is significant because the Germans had, especially all these new tanks, like the Ferdinand tank destroyer, which is very suited to defense. also the new Panther and the Tiger. If they had stayed on the defensive, then these tanks would have been close to the repair stations, close to the supplies, so they wouldn't have been as susceptible to mechanical breakdowns and everything that come with launching an attack into foreign territory, because you're very close to everything that you need to repair it and stuff. This would also, if they stayed on the defensive around this time, this would have also allowed them to train their crews more for the new Panther tanks. The crews weren't trained. If they had stayed defending, they would have been able to train them and have been better prepared for the upcoming battle. And the Soviets would have attacked in the future, that's for certain, because actually Operation Kutuzov, which we talked about earlier, the northern attack, Soviet counterattack, that actually wasn't originally planned as a counterattack. It was planned as a major offensive, which was supposed to occur around the time the Germans attacked Kursk, but the Germans struck first, so they had to modify that slightly. But yeah, if they stayed on the defensive like that, there's a good chance they would have been able to do a lot of damage to attacking Soviet forces and potentially win the battle. So that in my opinion, that probably would have been the best choice for the Germans. But another thing was that Hitler was all about he was all about prestige and everything and making Germany look strong. He thought, especially for propaganda, and also just so Germany wouldn't look weak, he didn't want to go on the defense. He was actually already a little bit beforehand with the Third Battle of Kharkov. He was very, very, very resistant to allowing von Manstein to let the Soviets take ground before attacking them. So he really didn't like the defensive stance. And yeah, so that probably would have been the best option. And the last thing is, what if Hitler had allowed von Manstein to continue his attack? Because remember, he was, after Prokhorovka, even though the Germans had withdrawn a little bit, they were still, in the south at least, they were still on the verge of getting the breakthrough that they needed, von Manstein was. So if they had allowed that offensive to continue, it's possible that it would have failed, because there was still one more line of defense. But if it had succeeded, and there is a decent chance that it would have, then there were no other Soviet units really in the area that could have defended, because that was their last line. And so the open fields would have been, which were good for maneuvering tanks and stuff, would have been open for the Germans to move into, and then they could outflank the other Soviet armies in the area, holding the line, and then everything the front would possibly collapse for a little bit. Even if they won the battle that way or in some other way, though, it probably wouldn't, or it wouldn't have really changed the outcome of the war, because really after the battle of Kursk, this was kind of the nail in the coffin for the Germans, because they never were able to go on the offensive again. But arguably after Stalingrad, or possibly even after the Battle of Moscow in 1941, when Operation Barbarossa failed, the Germans had kind of sealed their fate. It would have been a very, very, very tough uphill battle for them to win the war at this point. But the one thing to consider is winning Kursk. It would have certainly stalled the Soviet advance for a while, so it would have taken longer for them to organize. It would take a while for them to reorganize their forces after that major defeat, and then go on the offensive again, which some people argue it might, if they had dealt some serious blows like that, they might have been able to reach a peace treaty with the Soviets, which I don't think they would have, because that's my opinion. I don't think Stalin would be, or Hitler would be especially Stalin really, because Hitler might have considered a treaty, but at this point in the war, seeing how dire it was, but Stalin definitely not. And actually, really, Hitler probably wouldn't even either, as if you look towards the end of the war, the Germans were actually trying to send ambassadors and stuff to the Western Allies through people through the neutral countries like Sweden and stuff for peace, and they didn't want peace with the Soviets, so who knows? But it's possible it's possible they would have stalled the Soviet advance long enough for them to reorganize forces for more defensive operations. Basically, in the end, it would have dragged the war out much further. But anyways, that basically wraps it up for this presentation. I hope you all learned something tonight. Learned about the Battle of Kursk, or about World War II in general, maybe about the weapons here. But yeah, I hope everyone enjoyed it. Thank you very much.
Questions?
Yeah, does anyone have any questions now about World War II or Kursk or anything? No questions?
I think you covered everything.
Thank you. Yeah, I tried to give the best overview I could of not just the battle but the general situation as well.
What
So
was the most interesting thing you saw when you were recently in Berlin?
when I was recently in Berlin, I did see I saw a lot of interesting things. I think it pertaining just it would be kind of hard for me to decide on the spot, but just pertaining to the Battle of Kursk and the Eastern Front, I saw actually there was this place called the German Soviet Museum, or German Russian Museum, sorry, which it's on the outskirts of Berlin, but it was actually the building where they signed the initial like armistice or treaty, or ceasefire I should say, in on the Eastern Front with the Soviets. They signed a separate one with they signed a separate one later, which like the official treaty, but like the initial like ceasefire, initial treaty, everything that was signed at that location on the outskirts of Berlin in this building, and it's now a museum. They had a lot of like Soviet weapons and stuff. The coolest thing was they had 5 Soviet tanks outside. They had a T-34, like the one here, except the one at the museum was the 85 version that I mentioned earlier. And they had an assault gun. They had an IS-2 heavy tank, which was kind of like the Russian or Soviet answer to the Tiger tank, but that came a little later in the war. They had an assault gun, an ISU 120 or 152. They had some artillery guns or some anti-tank guns. They had a tank destroyer, which actually Su-85s fought in this battle as well, which is what that was. But yeah, it was a very interesting place to visit.
And where did you find these models?
So a lot of these models I just got off of like eBay and stuff. They're die cast. Most of these are die cast models. This one's actually plastic, but it looks pretty nice for a plastic model. But yeah, they're mostly metal die cast. Yeah, mostly off of eBay. But I have a pretty big collection of these at home actually. I have a lot. I actually have more vehicles that fought in Kursk, but I didn't want to bring too many because I didn't want them to get damaged. But yeah.
So you were actually there then? You were actually there?
I was in Berlin like about 2 weeks ago. I was in Berlin for like a week and a half, and I didn't get to see the Kursk battlefield, but I did see a lot of other historical sites related to World War II. Like we saw the German History Museum, which had some weapons and stuff, and like related to the war. Like they had a V2 rocket engine and some small arms and stuff. And then the German Soviet Museum. Then of course all the other historical sites in Berlin, like the Brandenburg Gate and stuff. But yeah, so I actually did get to see some history right there related to World War II for the first time.
Why were you in Berlin?
I was there for a international history competition for this thing called Quiz Bowl, where you basically like buzz to answer history. Or this one was specifically history, but they do all sorts of topics. But you basically buzz in for the other team, kind of like Jeopardy, to answer these questions. And yeah, it was the internationals. There was actually a German military history side event for this, and I got 9th in it. I missed the playoffs by 1 spot because they accepted the top 8, and a lot of it was like medieval history, which I'm studying it hard, but that was my one weakness, so I wasn't able to get through. But our team actually in the team event, the regular team event, our team got 4th place in the world, which is pretty cool. And then we got a bronze medal from another event as well. But yeah.
How long were you there?
Huh?
How long were you there?
I was there for about a week and a half, and then we went to Dresden for like 2 days. We saw some cool things in Dresden as well. Actually, it's been since it was actually firebombed by the Allies in World War II. Like almost the whole city was destroyed, but they completely rebuilt it, and it actually looks pretty historic because they rebuilt a lot of these historic monuments and stuff, like cathedrals and everything, to look it's a very beautiful city. And we actually stopped in Dublin on the way back, where we stayed at a hotel which was actually the site of a famous battle from Irish history, the Battle of Clontarf. It was actually the hotel was actually a castle, like an original castle, which was pretty cool.
It was a very good presentation.
Hmm?
Very good presentation.
Oh, thank you very much. Thank you very much. I'm glad you enjoyed it. I'm glad you learned. Hopefully, you learned something from this.
Yeah.
But